Good evening, and again, welcome to a special edition of RFL. I'm Richard French. Well, the Pope has just arrived at Madison Square Garden, where a packed house of 20,000+ people waiting for him to deliver Mass. Pontiff has just left Central Park. Let's get to Elizabeth Herr, who's joining us from there with the very latest.
Good evening to you. We are overlooking Central Park, where the crowd just went wild when the Pope passed by in his Pope-mobile. And we just got word he is now at his final stop of the day at Madison Square Garden. With an estimated 80,000 people cheering him on, the Pope waved and smiled his way through Central Park, making his way to his last stop while in New York. This after spending about an hour in East Harlem with school children, immigrants, and refugees. A lighter moment following a morning of profound prayers. A prayer for peace from Pope Francis, sharing the stage with religious leaders from around the world, including a rabbi and an imam.
God of peace, bring your peace to our violent world. Peace in the hearts of all men and women.
A powerful message at one of our nation's most sacred sites, the 9/11 Memorial, where the Pope first met with the victims' families to offer his blessings. He began his historic day just hours earlier with a landmark address at the United Nations.
Any harm done to the environment, therefore, is harm to humanity.
As just the fourth Pope to speak before the General Assembly, Pope Francis spoke out against what he calls the economic and social exclusions of the poor, issuing a challenge against selfishness.
And should ensure that they are not subjective to oppressive lending systems.
So once again, Pope Francis is now at Madison Square Garden, where he is preparing to celebrate Mass before a crowd of some 20,000 people. He will spend the night here before leaving for Philadelphia tomorrow. Elizabeth Herr, ABC News, New York.
Well, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And let's bring in our panel right now. We're joined by our anchors, Fox 1 News anchors Mike Gilliam and Courtney Kane. Thank you both very much. Anthony Miserandino from Fordham University, also a visiting research scholar at Oxford. Sister Anastasia Lott of Mary Knowles Sisters, and Maurice Timothy Reedy. He's executive director of America Magazine, the National Catholic Review. Thank you all for joining us. It has been an amazing week so far. It's amazing how much this pontiff has been able to pack into already just a few days, and he's not even done with 2/3 of the trip. Moving earlier today when he went to a school, and he said it was the most important stop on his trip, and that's including stops with the joint session of Congress to the UN, and obviously he'll be speaking to as many as 4 million people in Philadelphia, but yet nonetheless, sister, important because of the constituents, if you will. Kids, largely Latin American and African American in terms of coming to this country from other places, but it was kind of echoing a sentiment that I think we're going to hear a little bit more of in the Mass tonight, which is they're all God's children. Too often, too much of this population has been forgotten, and it's his point, among others, and major issues we'll talk about this hour, that they don't go forgotten anymore.
He loves young people. He loves the children. He's been an educator himself. But he wants inclusion. The example of the school was a very diverse school. And in his speech with the UN and in some other contexts, he's put education and spirituality together several times. So I think that great opportunity for him to be with a population that he likes, and he always is talking hope and dreams. And I think youth represent hope and dreams in a way that the rest of us are, we haven't reached our dreams yet, but encouraging them to work for their dreams, to have dreams and to work for them.
And you're looking obviously at pictures from Madison Square Garden where the Pope will be addressing more than 20,000 people in audience there, and obviously millions on a national and in the hundreds of millions, certainly on a global level, if not even with the B. And give us a little bit of a historical context. Obviously, this Pope's first visit, we've had pontiffs before that have come, but even if you go back to John Paul II, it was a different vibe. There was a rock star quality to it, but he's had an agenda, if you will, the first joint session of Congress appearance. We've seen few posts before at the UN, but there has been strict messaging, given ideas, as we're going to see the Pope going to the altar soon enough, but give an idea in historical context what these few days have already been like.
I think it's really been spectacular. The fourth Pope to come to the States. The speech before Congress is very significant, and he invited people to follow 4 models. He talked about Martin Luther King, Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Merton, and Dorothy Day. He set them out as examples of prayer and action, attending to those that are marginalized. And it's this combination of prayer and action on behalf of the most needy that I think we'll see celebrated tonight as one of the major themes.
Obviously, you're familiar with Dr. King, but with Merton and Day, these were activists. These were people who courted controversy at the time here. If we could, let's explain a little bit about the procession that we're seeing going forward here. Let's describe to our audience, if you want to take a shot, at what we're seeing in the lead up to, obviously, the delivering of Mass.
Sure. I think Sister was talking about it earlier. I mean, you've got so many bishops and priests who are taking part of this. Some of my colleagues in American Magazine are there. You've got 15,000 people there.
Tough ticket to come by,
exactly.
By the way, yes.
But you need help distributing communion. So these are the priests who are starting to come in. I think you're seeing mostly bishops now, but this is just getting started. I mean, it's going to take a while for them to file in, so they got to start early. I
was joking before, if the pontiff himself delivers communion, I have a feeling a lot of people are going to go down the center aisle instead of going down the wings here. But in terms of not only the messaging, but also the imagery, for folks who forget, when he helped feed some of the homeless yesterday, when he stopped by a shelter, when he was in D.C. before he came to New York, today when he went to a school on East 112th Street in East Harlem, Mike, and then he'll be visiting a prison and seeing inmates on a personal basis tomorrow. I think that, as much as getting into a Fiat instead of a stretched limo, those are some of the things to not even active practicing Catholics, a laity who may have lapsed, or even people that aren't of the faith. Those are some of the images I think that are going to stick with people from what has been a jam-packed week.
I think that's absolutely true. I think that many people have been drawn in by some of those things. They actually come across as maybe kind of flash points that grab a person's attention, so to speak, to say, wait, this is a little bit different than other papal trips that I have seen to the United States. It's a lot different. What's with the Fiat? I'm so surprised by that, And I think that's resonating with people across this region right now, and people from all different communities, not just Catholics.
Yeah, and Courtney, we've talked before, we've either sat in Mass at St. Pat's, yes, or taken relatives when they come in to see it as one of those landmarks, but the doors have been open in a lot of ways for a lot of people, seeing not only what we saw with St. Matthew's down in D.C. before St. Patrick's, and obviously what will be historic masses of themselves when they go to Philadelphia. But this has also been, I think, an eye-opener for a lot of folks, that faith doesn't just have to be confined to a 45 or hour-minute sermon here. It can touch on subjects that people believe have a lot of relevance to the day. And I think, if anything, the messaging of this pontiff has really broken through to a lot of folks. They've been compelled and riveted to this.
Absolutely.
The ratings, I think, will be good.
I would have to agree, and I think it's really, he's having people look at the Catholic Church so differently because of his actions. And it's, as we've discussed, really a sense of inclusion. You don't have to be Catholic, you don't have to be rich, you don't have to be poor. The young people, he's drawing everyone in and really causing them to open a dialogue and look at the Catholic Church through different eyes, which is interesting.
But I wonder, is it very important for the Catholic Church at this juncture in time that something like this happen, given all
Well, I'll speak to you on that exact point that Mike raised, because for any of us who know the pews, there haven't been as many folks as a generation ago. My kids go to parochial schools. There's been a whole bunch that have been shuttered. Certainly economic health of some, where they could, put it on the arm, if you will, here and help out other. They've been tested as well for a variety of reasons that we all know. How critical at this time in juncture in this church right now is not only this pontiff, but this visit?
I think it's critical. I mean, I think, as you said, there's so many trends that are going against the church right now. And you have
and not just in the U.S., globally.
No,
a lot of people don't know that.
And now when the Pope was elected, I think a lot of people in the conclave, they had talked about electing somebody who could reform the Curia, and that's definitely one of his mandates. But I think they weren't expecting somebody who would be reaching out in this way. You know, the way that he gives interviews. He gave an interview with our magazine that got a lot of attention. He's very, the way on the plane where he talks about who am I to judge, he's been able to connect with people in a much more informal way that really speaks to people. And you know, there's so many people we've heard who say we're kind of giving the church a second look as a result of this Pope.
You know, it's funny, sister, I had a fellow nun last night who was waiting, saying, you know, there was a lot of recognitions. I'm still waiting for the women religious, and then all of a sudden there was more than a shout out last night at St. Pat's, and he's managed to connect so many different communities that have either felt marginalized, and certainly a lot of nuns that were under investigation that I think rightfully upset more than a few. They believe that there's been a lot of fence mending. Do you think that's fair?
Oh, I think it's fair. I think the fact that things ended, and they ended very happily from the point of view of women religious, he expresses his love for us. I think there's a lot of women who are still waiting to see what he means when he puts more emphasis on different, you know, that we're different and still valued, rather than equality.
Yep.
He emphasized not being the same in in other contexts today. So I think a lot of women are kind of curious, or more, to see when is he going to really make some moves that reflect some things he's sort of teased about. There was some expectation that there might be some folks named to higher positions in administration.
Yep.
Lots of women, although we are told that we shouldn't be talking about it, I think there's always little girls grow up seeing, are they allowed to be altar boys? Are they allowed to be altar servers? Some places welcome little girl participation. Some places welcome women to be electors.
And I
Others,
think that's one of those areas where it's going to be a wait and see if the deeds and works. And now let's take the Mass.
Be with you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you remain seated until the Holy Father has time to exit the building. While you wait, please pay attention to the following instructions for exiting the building and transportation. If you arrived by a parish-supplied bus, your bus will be loading on 7th Avenue.
Yes, exactly, and that's the cue. We missed the collections, as they said, but there was, at least for me, I don't know about for you guys, that defining moment when Cardinal Dolan thanked the pontiff, and it gave, as you guys were saying around the table when we were watching, an excuse for the audience to do what they've been waiting. And I think even beyond Madison Square Garden, just a collective applause for what so far has been a seamless papal visit to the States overall, but certainly a triumphant one as it relates to New York. Fair enough to say that this so far could not have gone better for the pontiff than even the Vatican could have hoped?
Well, I mean, he's packed schedule, as we've seen, and these major events coupled with these kind of personal encounters, yeah, it's gone very well. I mean, he's definitely looking a little tired, but I mean, that was very smooth, and I think people were very excited to, I saw the priests seem more excited than anybody. I think they just wanted to say thank you.
To that point, sister, and I don't want to make more of it than it is because it's a snapshot, but, and correct me if you guys disagree, but I think for understandable reasons, for the past decade plus, there has been an avalanche of bad news, and the apex of it, obviously, the abuse crisis, and not just what happened, but how it was aided and abetted by leadership, and how it was such a collective failure. And for so many, there was a point where, you know, people didn't broadcast they were Catholic, and all the good men and women that were in the priesthood, they almost guilt by associations and all that. A small part of the weight, I think, lifted a little bit in the last 5 days. And I think since really the Pope has come in, people have been looking for a reason to smile a little bit again, and you saw that in the faces of the priests that were there, of the clergy that were there, and I think the laity that were there, that they've been waiting for something like this. And I think in many ways, in different ways for different people, this Pope has given them a reason to stand a little taller. Do you think I'm overstating it, or do you think, or you see it?
I think that's a great characterization, quite frankly. But also, he has taken action. He did
Yes.
form a group of bishops and cardinals to look at the church abuse issues, and he's given authority to have at least 2 bishops, if not others in the limelight, brought up on charges. So he's taken that very seriously, tried to be very transparent and collegial. It's the church working through this difficult moment. He's taken that very seriously.
It just a positivity. I think we have video that we'll bring shortly. When at one point when Dolinas got up, when he was beaming, I forget. I apologize, but one of you said that there it is at this moment. That kind of was it. I think, Sister, you referenced, that's him or something,
I will say, in Cardinal Dolan's remarks, I think he hit a point of the relationality that Pope Francis has brought to the church that was maybe missing. We were very institutional for Cardinal Dolan to say, we're family. You came here, he emphasized all the family words, and I think that's what Pope Francis has been doing, is emphasizing relationality. I think that's part of what made a difference in some of the things he's even said with the sisters. Part of the experience of what's been going on is being treated like you're a cog in an institution that needs to be investigated or followed up. Pope Francis comes along and says, I love you. I don't know if it's okay for a pope to say this or not, but it's a relationality that's really fundamental.
If I could just press on that for a second. I mentioned your backgrounds, but you've gone to some of the more impoverished corners of this world and done hand-to-hand, not only aid, but also ministry. And to that end, that's what he said he wanted. The imagery of not only open the doors to the church, but get out of the doors and go to the people and stuff. And I would just imagine for someone who spent their professional life in this, that's music to your ears.
With the religious last night, he was very affirming and then challenging. Get out there and do some work. But I think the kind of work that he's emphasizing is it's relational. The shepherd should smell of the sheep. Very interesting image, but I understand that the plane the other day, they called it Shepherd One. The old image of the shepherding of the priests and whatever. But I think he's really saying it's get out there, be with the people, rub shoulders. The other thing, and I think this is part of the image of meal, and we had the ecumenical, when we do things together, he talks about dialogue. When you get out there with people, you're coming at, you understand their problems from a different way. When you're teaching, it's personal when you're side by side. And that makes some of the doctrine a little, because you see the impact on somebody who's suffering. I think this is what he's done around some of the hard issues, is had the mercy, the sense of the person suffering, and we need to be attentive to that.
Do we really have like a 78-year-old pope who has now moved the church in another direction or to a different era?
Certainly there's movement. I think time will tell yet. He didn't say changing the rules on marriage and divorce. Annulment is still a possibility. Let's speed up the process. Let's make it more humane. So there are some differences here. And I think the characterization you were talking about earlier, Richard, about this particular pontiff and his presence to people, the warmth, the reaching out, is in such sharp contrast to what preceded him. If you go back to 10 years, Benedict XVI was just the opposite on all those levels, all those virtues. That wasn't who he was. He was the ivory tower person. He was the person protecting doctrine.
He was the administrator.
He was protecting doctrine at every point, and I think took us back in the wrong direction and kind of slowed down progress. So change is certainly on the horizon.
But change also has to be tempered in that what the public views is, okay, well, let's check a few things off the list. Let's make sure the sister can be a priest. Let's make sure priests can marry. Let's get rid of, annulment. That's not how the church works, and there's analogies for how glacial it can be for change. Just the discussion points of this, the idea that the Pope would even say, who am I to judge as it relates to homosexuals and their place in the church, or the subject. Don't think overnight the church is going to all of a sudden bless gay marriage. So I think expectations to a certain degree have to be tempered. If people think, while there has been action, I would argue tangible action, the rapidity of some of these things to catch up to the social landscape, let alone in the States, that's not a realistic timetable, right?
Right, and I think it's important to remember that he's looking at the international church, and he's very concerned about people in the third world and the developing world who are dealing with the effects of climate change. So while some of these questions may be a priority for us in the West, for him, he's looking at the whole picture, and for him, the issues that the poor are facing are really pressing and are damaging the family, and I think that's what they'll talk about at the Synod.
There was a portion that he said in tonight that it stood out for me at least, and it's a little long, so if you could bear with me, I'm gonna read that caption again. This is from the homily from Pope Francis earlier tonight at the Mass that you've just heard at Madison Square Garden. He said, "Big cities also conceal the faces of all those people who don't appear to belong or are second-class citizens. In big cities, beneath the roar of traffic, beneath the rapid pace of change, so many faces pass by unnoticed because they have no right to be there, no right to be part of the city. They are the foreigners, the children who go without schooling, those deprived of medical insurance, the homeless, the forgotten elderly. These people stand at the edges of our great avenues, in our streets, in deafening anonymity. They become part of the urban landscape, which is more and more taken for granted in our eyes and especially our hearts." And as you said, sometimes wherever the audience is, they think it's only talking to them. That's a global statement, and I think he's done everything so far, and I think it will be only echoed, if not amplified, in Philadelphia. That is, if one message he's trying to break through, that you can't have half the population, or even a smaller portion than half, as it seems by generation, that's doing okay, and the bottom half that's not. And whether people don't like the terms income redistribution or whatever it is, he's not going to let it go. He's going to keep hammering on that point here. And some people like certain messages of it, some people don't. And maybe that's the best way, because there's a little bit of everything for and against people's positions. But if people think that this is all happy-go-lucky, he does not suffer fools gladly, I think, and I think he's going to be banging on this point.
Oh, 100% true. He's not going to let us forget for a moment the poor are in our midst. That's who he is. And if I remember reading a little piece when they were doing the elections for the next pope, when he was elected, there was some sense that he might be the person. One of his colleagues leaned over and said to him, "Don't forget the poor." And what did he do? He chose the name Francis.
Could you explain that a little bit, to the Franciscan portion, why Assisi, or the importance of it, and why he took the name and what it means?
Because he's the saint, the person, the model. Again, he talked about 4 models yesterday, but the model of how to lead a good life and be responsive. That was Francis's tradition. And there's the funny quote that gets attributed to Francis. He says, "Preach the gospel always. Use words if you must." So it's really all about action, and as you characterized it, that's what we've seen. We've seen a lot of symbolic actions that demonstrate here and now, touching people, reaching out, being present to the disenfranchised. He's not going to let us forget
to the poor, but also, you guys please help me out here, but he also tended to the earth, and that was, there's multiple connotations by choosing that name, and he's only echoed him, I think, as we've seen in D.C. and New York.
Yeah, and St. Francis also met with the Sultan, so he had some kind of outreach to the Muslim community, and we saw a little bit of that this morning at the 9/11 memorial.
And he certainly recognized the tragedy around Mecca, where 700 people died, and people thought that was significant as well. Well, right off the bat, he acknowledged a population that sometimes was all but avoided in the church. Guys, this doesn't happen in a vacuum. These conversations, when he was in Washington today, buried today was the guy he made cry 4 times yesterday, Speaker Boehner, who's announced his resignation. And nothing to do with this, but nonetheless, the positions he's taken, whether it be on the environment and global warming, whether it be talking about income inequality right now, do you think that this has carryover on the American political side, where I think the president's got to be careful. There doesn't seem to be too much of a combined embrace here with the Pope, but nonetheless, Pope's got higher approval ratings than anybody. So how much do you think his word carries, guys, beyond the trip to the U.S. when he flies back to the Vatican? How much between now and 2016 does this get referenced?
That's a tough question.
Well, that's why I asked.
That's a loaded question, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I think that it has to be something that people will have in the back of their minds, but whether or not it will change policy, I'm not so sure about that. I'm not sure that policy is really getting changed at all in our Congress at this point. I did notice that Senator Gillibrand made a comment about the John Boehner thing before all of this happened, and she said something to the effect that hopefully Mr. Boehner will realize that he's speaking specifically to what's going on here, and that he will heed some of the Pope's words. And then all of a sudden this happened today. I was like, wow.
Interesting timing, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, whether they be Catholic or not, lawmakers, how can they ignore some of these messages? Because they really are global messages, and messages that affect all of us here in the United States of America. So whether or not it will, reach down to policy, it's hard to say, but I do think it's got them thinking.
Yeah.
Well, I guarantee you one thing. In today's day and age, this I know a little about, there'll be a political commercial that will use the quote, a soundbite from the Pope. He will literally be part of this for whatever that means here. But he certainly is speaking at a time where these issues are really relevant. It's not just a theological debate here or whatever else. He's speaking to obviously a population that's looking for somebody to break through. He was at the UN, and obviously he was talking about not only the need for peace, but if you think about somebody that could help to serve as a broker here in some of these intractable situations, past this trip, you could see a role for that extending. I mean, he's not going to, kick his feet up in the Vatican here. This is the... And I guess I'd ask, from a historical perspective, do we see now a new model post-Benedict where you retire rather than die necessarily in the job? That he's 78, that he looks at, I'm going to have whatever his window that he chooses to have, but a 5, 6, 7 year window, and I'm going to cram as much as I can here because I'm not running for re-election. Do you think that that's kind of the modeling we may see here, well beyond even this trip and post-Philadelphia?
I hope so. Clearly, he's got an agenda to be present to the poor physically, symbolically, and to remind us of our responsibility to do that together. He points to income inequality. He doesn't say capitalism is bad 100%, toss it out the window. But the greedy side, the selfish side of capitalism that ignores those numbers and doesn't see the face, doesn't live in the light of the face of the poor, doesn't stop underneath the bridge to help those in need. He's going to remind us of that. I think you're onto something. He's not going to let us forget that. Yeah. So that's where the difference is. He's going to do that night and day for as many years. And certainly having a pope resign, I think it's a very courageous act, quite frankly.
Yep.
So that's a nice precedent for Benedict to have established. But I think Francis is going to die with his boots on.
Yep.
At least that's my hope.
He doesn't take vacations,
No.
so
Right.
he just works and works.
Sister, it seemed to me, maybe it's just depending on the parish you're in. So I used to remember hearing about feeding the hungry and clothing the naked a lot more than I did in the last 10 years or so, 15 years on Sundays. Certainly, this Pope made it clear that that's part of the faith. And so again, for somebody who's made that such a huge part of what they did, do you, when he leaves New York, do you personally feel more uplifted and more hopeful than you did before he touched down in D.C.?
Oh, I think I do. It's been exciting. It's been stimulating. I think a lot is what are we going to see happen. But we've talked about change, and I think the big change is from an emphasis on what the church teaches, what is right belief, to an emphasis on what is the right thing to be doing. He hasn't taken away from the right belief or changed it, but he's saying get out there and do something, feed the poor, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, get out there, be active, do something with your faith, not just have it all according to the catechism. He's saying, who am I to judge about a lot of things? I get that life is tough. He phrased that in a lot of different ways. Try to do the right thing, put a lot more emphasis on action. So hopefully our priests and others who are teaching will also help us keep shifting toward the active practice of faith in the marketplace, as my mother might say.
More actions than words.
More than actions.
All right, Tim, give us a forecast of what you're going to write here after this is said and done, in that there's some tough math, in that lot of parishes closing, a lot of parochial schools shutting doors, a lot of offertory baskets not as filled as they need to, a lot of seminaries, looking at graduating classes of 2, right? Obviously, this can only help what happened here, but what's the messaging going forward, next steps for the church, not just doctrine and policy, but actions on the ground, because that was basically his call to action, do something. What
Right.
happens next?
What happens next? Well, I think it's important to remember that the American church is a very large church, and that there are sections of the country in the West, Southwest, that are growing quite a bit. And I think the Northeast is kind of the counterexample there. So I think it's important to remember. And in parts of Westchester County, churches are growing it's the urban parishes that are on the decline. So I think that's a good sign, and I think that will continue. But what will people take away from his message? I mean, I think from the beginning, this Pope says that, it's not about me and what I do, do as I do, take this message out forward, don't be afraid. So I think that's unique to this Pope, is that he makes each of us feel challenged, like, okay, well, how am I going to help the environment? What am I going to do? I hope he leaves us with a sense of hope, because that is, I think something he's introduced, for example, to the climate change debate. He doesn't throw up in his hands and say, well, there's no way forward. He's saying, no, there is a way forward. We still have time. How we're going to do that, it's going to be difficult, but it can be done.
And he said that on literally every issue. There
Yeah.
is a way forward. Let's have a dialogue. Let's discuss the issue. Let's avoid the polarizations of extreme positions. So there is a way. There is a dialogue to happen.
If he can
Lots
make
of hope.
Washington do that, we're going to ask him to part the waters next.
The first miracle.
Hey, listen, when the New York Post says New York calls themselves the New York Pope for a day, as they did, you've broken through. You guys are good at figuring out the headlines of tomorrow or today. What do you think the takeaway from this is going to be at the end of the day? We haven't seen Philly yet, and the amazing imagery I think that's going to be attached to it, but through 2 legs of this trip, what do you think the takeaway is?
I think it's probably something along the lines that this Pope rocks, and he drives his point home. That he got his point across. I think that over and over he talked about motivating people to get out there and help. I do wonder whether or not big business is going to hear what this Pope had to say, because I think that's very important too. And that's what he's kind of talking to right there. And we haven't really discussed that.
No.
We haven't heard from big business on that.
We haven't.
I have to say too, I do believe that I'm hopeful, his message of hope, that it's going to change, perhaps soften the way people view the Catholic Church, because I think he's different than what we've ever seen before from a Pope.
Yep.
So we'll see what happens.
I've seen more questions and interest from people that aren't of the faith and saying, well, tell me if I like this guy. Tell me. We'll see how that all plays out. I want to thank everybody for being part of the conversation and also helping us bring the Mass to the audience. Thank you all. That's all the time that we have for tonight, but keep staying and we'll have much more on this channel.